Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and here with me, of course, is Tho Bishop, my co-host and associate editor. And yesterday was the State of the Union address, everybody's favorite annual event where we watch presidents drone on for a very long time, and then there's antics from someone in the gallery, or maybe the Supreme Court justices are sitting there, and then this gives lazy journalists fodder for days afterward, where they don't have to talk about any real news. They can just talk about what somebody in the audience said about something. I mean, these people are basically gossip columnists, so that's so the State of the Union is a big, important thing for them. I think mostly what we do here on Radio Rothbard is we just basically look at it because we just want to hate on the president and the Congress, basically see which horrible ideas they think we should hear about, and maybe they should push, and what trial balloons they're floating for their next disastrous policies. So it's kind of a peek into what Washington thinks is important, and what the parties are going to set up as their little fights over the next few months, and maybe even over the next year. Of course, I mean, there's always a huge gap between what they say publicly and what they actually believe, or what they're actually planning to do to you. But I think you can still get a little bit of information from watching these speeches. Or if you're like me, you kind of skim the speech and then you read the transcript, which saves a lot of time. It's a lot faster. If you're pressed for time, you have a life, I might recommend that method for you. Skim the transcript, and then you'll have a good sense of that stuff. But though, thanks for joining me here. State of the Union address. What should we be most alarmed about from this thing? And what did you find to be one of the most interesting points?
Well, unfortunately, my white fur coat is in the cleaners today, unlike Marjorie Taylor Greene, which did a good job of getting some attention for herself by yelling liar and a few other choice words during the ceremonies. I think last night's I watched it this morning in full disclosure on hyperspeed with a YouTube wrap-up. But I do think that it was an interesting speech in a variety of ways. One is that there's no real, I think, big policy takeout from this talk. I mean, obviously there's little most of it was backwards looking in terms of Biden touting bipartisan accomplishments, and it had a tenor of a general election pitch, trying to win over moderates in the future. And what's interesting is I actually saw sort of right-wing populist Twitter kind of praising or lamenting the degree to which Biden's rhetoric sounded very populist, very Trumpy, with a lot of emphasis on the corrupt, rigged system, on American jobs, on American manufacturing, right? All these sort of generic, sort of middle American talking points and the like. And so one of the things I think is interesting that, my big takeaway is I'm trying to imagine what other Democrat out there could give the speech that Biden gave last night. And this is not to give Biden too much credit. I mean, he did make through an hour-plus long speech, which for a man in his condition is somewhat praiseworthy. I don't know what pharmaceutical drugs he was on, performance enhancers, but they did the job. He got through it. But it was a very normal speech for a very non-normal political party right now. And, there's not a whole bunch of kind of crazy substance, I think, to break down with it. Obviously, there's inflating of, the strength of the economy and how many jobs we've produced and all that sort of stuff. There's some allusions to really bad policies, on labor regulations and tax increases and kind of standard fare of things. It was just, I think the tone was very interesting of it being a very middle American focused, spectacle. And the other side of it is the degree to which I remember back in the Obama years, Joe Wilson from South Carolina screaming, "You lie," right? Like this was a gigantic scandal of the time. I mean, it dominated, the news circuit. It was a sign of unraveling civility and this great American democracy, right? And yet last night, I mean, there was like nonstop. I mean, particularly once you got 2/3 of the way in, it was just kind of nonstop, just heckling from the crowd. On issues like fentanyl, on issues like Biden, accusing Republicans of wanting to end Social Security and Medicare, on a variety of things. I mean, the third act of that speech was just kind of in my opinion, an entertaining, political wrestling event. Almost getting to a House of Parliament style, just shouting down of the speaker there, and so just as we are charting the decay of respectability and of American democracy, last night was, I think, a next step in the decaying of the frictions there in D.C. Again, most of it superficial. I think the only true hatred of the night was Mitt Romney having some choice comments for George Santos, the new congressman from New York. But yeah, so it was nothing too I think new ground being toyed there, but it was very much a campaign talk, and it'll be interesting to see if Biden is in fact in campaign mode come next year.
Well, it's always funny, this whole stupid thing where if the president's speaking, you're supposed to sit in awed silence and never interrupt and never express displeasure. I think it's funny that arguably the world's oldest functioning democracy, the United Kingdom, have these people ever watched Prime Minister's Questions, right? The heckling, the booing, the shouting at the chief executive that takes place in that parliament. But the much younger parliament, that is the U.S. legislature, you're supposed to sit around in silence, and if you speak up, well, this is disrespectful. So obviously, there's no connection whatsoever between the American ideal of legislative proper behavior and the British ideal. The British ideal is much longer, has lasted much longer. That same parliament's been around for, I don't know, 700 years in different forms. And the U.S. legislature, it took, about 80 years for the United States to go from new country to failed state embroiled in bloody civil war. So, wow, America. So clearly the way it does things are so much better. So let's not say Britain's perfect or whatever, but spare us I just want to say it's the stupid nonsense, this whole be respectful of whoever's speaking in the Congress, whatever. Forget it. It's stupid. Let's stop claiming that. In fact, I think we'd be a lot better off as a democracy if people yelled at each other in the legislature a lot more, because it would probably promote honesty and help people really get conflicts out into the open instead of all this secret behind the scenes stuff where everything is determined ahead of time and nothing ever actually happens in public in terms of lawmaking and lobbying and people taking sides. So yeah, okay, just let's not even talk about that anymore. Protectors of public respectability. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, I love it when stuff like that happens. It's great. And yeah, looking at this speech, I agree with you. It was pretty safe. I mean, it was nothing like the V for Vendetta speech that he gave during the campaign with the fascist red background and everything, which was just creepy weird. Clearly wasn't trying to go for that vibe with this speech. And if anything, some of the stuff was thankfully sane, like on China, with this speech coming right after this whole balloon hysteria thing. He said, well, China, we don't want war. We prefer competition, whatever you mean. But I don't know if he meant economic competition or geopolitical competition or whatever. But that's better than basically trying to create the image that, I will not stand by while the Chinese destroy America. I mean, that could have been a position he might have taken, but he didn't. What is going on behind the scenes with the National Security Council and stuff, I have no idea. But that's usually a winner to rile up the Americans and play the "we hate foreigners" card. And he chose not to do that. So I guess somebody calculated that, maybe Americans aren't as excited about foreign meddling as we would like. But of course, generally bad on Ukraine, and nothing really good to celebrate there. And so, for the most part, the same old stuff. This brings a point, though, that you and I have often talked about again, though, right? You noted it's got the populist tone, talking about all these problems with America, a lot of the same problems that conservative type populists would point out, or that us liberal, free market liberal types would point out, with corruption or basically people using the system to enrich themselves and stuff. And that just illustrates, though, that we could talk all day in vague terms about the things we think are wrong with America, right? Whereas deep down, once you start to get down to the details, totally different ideas about how to fix those problems. And so just admitting that things are wrong with the system doesn't actually mean anything, right? Because you list these things you think are wrong. Oh, but by the way, we'll get to my prescribed solutions later, but right now we'll just be united about the things that we think are bad. So then what you find out then is that, oh, well, what those people think will solve these problems are horrible, horrible ideas, even though 10 minutes earlier we're all thinking that we were all on the same page. And so you and I find that with our readers often, or with people that we encounter just even in person at events, where they're like, why are we still talking about why the Fed is bad? Why are we still talking about how taxes are still high, or that government spending is still high? Everyone I talk to agrees that those things are bad. So we should just be talking about what the next steps are in terms of passing legislation. I think people are really, really getting a wrong impression of just how much people agree with them about what the proper solutions are to these. Yeah, everyone agrees the government is corrupt and does bad things. But if you think everyone you meet has the same solutions as you have in mind, that's just straight wrong. Because when I talk to people out in the real world, people who 1 minute will say, oh, yeah, Washington full of criminals, ha, 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 and we all have a joke about how bad Washington is. And then they turn around and they're like, boy, and they're just not spending enough on my, welfare, on my Medicare. They're just not spending enough on this or on that, or they're not helping the Ukrainians enough. See, everyone agrees that they hate the government, but no one seems to agree on what to do about it. And so that's just what we keep encountering over and over again. And I think this speech was a good illustration of that. A nice list of all these things we can bond about that are wrong, but boy, you start to get into the specifics of what the solutions are, and it's a nightmare scenario from the Democrats, of course, from many GOP people as well. But there's nothing to agree with them on that. They just were wise enough, I think, to avoid some of the details.
Well, and I particularly enjoyed the juxtaposition of, like, at one point he's railing against, the greed, the greed of big pharma, and we're slashing insulin prices and the like. And then a little bit later, it's like, oh yeah, and we need to keep pumping money into developing these new vaccines that we desperately need in order for us to truly ever recover from COVID after I get rid of this emergency thing. It's like, yeah, that checks out, right? And yeah, so you have a lot of that throughout there. Again, we're going back to to corporate greed. I mean, Elizabeth Warren had some standing applause lines over, we're finally going to make those billionaires really pay their fair share. Don't you know that not a penny of our federal tax burden has gone up as a result of Biden policies? Anyone paying under $400,000 has not seen their taxes go up one dime under Joe Biden. Email us if you think that is true. So yeah, it was kind of a standard, but again, it was very much, I think it was very much a 90s sort of flair to their approach to politics. And it was interesting. I don't know if you saw, you're a lot more sane than I, so you probably didn't. But it was interesting to see the GOP response to it, the official one, not the heckling in the crowd, where you had Miss Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is the youngest Republican governor now, or maybe governor general, and very no one ever looks really good doing the response to the State of the Union address. My favorite recent one was when Joe Kennedy, when the young Kennedy clan responded to Trump with a car in the background, which if I was a Kennedy, I wouldn't necessarily be bring up car homages. But
a car on a bridge.
Yeah, he was like, he had a bottle of Irish whiskey next to him, I'm sure. But and that speech was, I think, for a large part, drivel. I mean, it was all about communicating to, I think 50, 60-year-old Fox News viewers who are already firmly on her side. But to her credit, she was able to get one, pithy little line that breaks down to a 15-second tweet, which is all you can really want in this sort of environment. And it was something to the extent of, the divide in America now is not left versus right, but normal versus crazy. And again, I think that is a dynamic there which Biden was deliberately trying to steer away from. It was something the Republicans were desperately trying to force in the conversation. And again, I don't think there's many. Again, if we think about this in the proper context, I mean, nothing. Last night's speech, I don't think went one iota in terms of changing the policy agenda. Mitch McCarthy, Biden gave shout outs to Mitch McConnell and started off with saying some very nice words about Kevin McCarthy and congratulating him on the speakership and yada yada. Agenda, I don't think that there was a little bit of a weird sort of an olive branch, if you will, at least rhetorically, to domestic energy production. Which was clearly a tip to Joe Manchin there about how we still need domestic energy production because we're going to need it for at least another decade, and like this is the sort of problem though is that trying to get like what we desperately need right now is like investment in like multi-billion-dollar lines of like all the infrastructure, refineries, and like. The like, and if it's like, oh, well, you don't worry, you got a good 10 years before we're going to completely eliminate this side of things. But it's kind of hard to get that investment in there.
We need more investment. By the way, we want to raise capital gains taxes. We want to raise tax on the rich who invest into these things. So it's just going to be magic investment from somewhere.
But so I mean, maybe that is maybe we're going to see maybe some compromise there in terms of some sort of domestic energy agreement of some sort. But again, ultimately, I don't think it's going to change. This was not some outlining some big bold vision that Republicans are going to have to fight against for another 2 years. It just is a campaign speech, and again, that's where the eyes, and this was the elephant in the room. As much as people want to ignore, the Biden team wants to ignore it, is we are now getting to. I mean, this is February of 2023. Campaign season kicks off for next time around. In full, probably by June. You have debates usually starting around late July, early August for the next cycle. So we're now looking at getting close to a 6-month, 7-month countdown for the formation of the next presidential cycle. And I know just got over the midterms and still dealing with that hangover. And many of our audience are disinterested in the course at all. But that is the question: is this a sort of speech that can get certain people, particularly big donors, to buy into a 80-year-old Joe Biden round 2 dynamic, and I don't know if that was quite delivered last night.
Well, I mean, I guess these speeches are also helpful for really highlighting who's in the top rank of the parties, right? Just as you mentioned, and so who's up there with Joe Biden, right? It's obviously not Kamala Harris. Hard to imagine Elizabeth Warren being a nationwide figure. So, yeah, I think it also kind of highlighted a little bit how shallow the Democratic bench is on really in terms of who would run against this guy. So it just seems that he's really just trying to position himself as moderate old statesman this time because, it's already going into the next cycle. And claiming, of course, great victories and such. And that, of course, I think was some of the biggest BS out of this this speech was all of these great achievements that he was pointing to. All this job creation, right? Because they're counting jobs created from like the trough of the COVID lockdowns. And oh, look at all these jobs we created from when the economy, when we nuked the economy. And let's count all the jobs that we created since then. Of course, you got back some jobs that you had nuked back in 2020, which, by the way, Joe Biden had supported the destruction of those jobs with lockdowns and all of these business closures under COVID. Oh, but he created all of the jobs that were finally allowed to come back after that. And so that's what he's counting. And then it's the same way with just this last jobs report, right? Is we were told that that 500,000 new payroll jobs were created. Don't mention that actually in the non-seasonally adjusted numbers, it was about 22.5 million jobs lost, as is typical in January. But this number, the seasonal adjustment was 3 million. So this whole, oh man, the economy is gangbusters. We created 500,000 jobs. Those are imaginary jobs. They exist only on paper due to a seasonal adjustment. Do we expect that maybe that is a sensical seasonal adjustment? Does that make sense? Maybe, but maybe not, considering that the economy is in flux and we know that the economy is currently on the edge of recession. If we look at the yield curve, if we look at home prices, if we look at wage growth, the economy is not normal right now. So just looking at a not seasonally adjusted number of 2.5 million jobs gone in January, which is the reality, and then saying, well, we just decided, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that actually we gained this blowout number of 500,000. It's not based on reality. And so then the administration crows about that, and then they're adding that into their made-up numbers about all these jobs they quote-unquote created over the last couple of years. And so it's clear he's already trying to create this legacy of look at all this amazing economic growth that has occurred when it's just simply not there at all. In terms of jobs, barely ahead still of where we were in late 2019. So the economy is basically flat now for 3 years, thanks to COVID, and by that I mean COVID lockdowns and government intervention in COVID. But that's their position, right? Oh, the disease caused the economy to collapse, not us, not our lockdowns. And we created all these millions of jobs since then. And so that would imply that we're millions of jobs then above where we were in 2019, but of course we're not. That's not the case at all. And then if you look at disposable income, it's well below trend. And so many of these measures that ordinary people are really suffering. And I think that's why you have to come out and say that there's all these problems with the government. If everybody actually agreed that they were doing really well and that they were better off now than they were 3 or 4 years ago, you wouldn't have to go on and on about all the corruption and the problem with the government and how the rich aren't taxed enough, because people would generally be happy economically. But it's understood that people feeling pretty precarious, and in these surveys of do people think they're better off now than they were years ago, the majority say no. And so people recognize that something's wrong. Now, I have no doubt that you have plenty, that they could trot out endless numbers of mainstream economists who would smugly chortle and say, oh, people don't understand how good they have it. All the numbers show me that the economy is fine. And you would get some of these millennials saying, it's not even a recession, it's a vibe session. You're just getting bad vibes. Everything's great. And so there's plenty of those people still in existence, but people in the real world, they're tapped out on their credit cards. Their cars are being repossessed at the highest numbers since 2008. They've burned through their excess cash that was printed out of nothing that they received during 2020 and 2021. And this is belied by the fact that the government has to talk about all the things that are wrong right now. And the problem is that the solutions to all that are going to be more government spending, more deficit spending, more creating money out of thin air, more government regulations, and that's what we should expect that the administration is going to try and push. But I mean, it was a narrow victory, but boy, is it good that there's a divided government now, and that the GOP managed to get control of the House. Because if that hadn't been true, we'd be hearing all about the agenda they have planned for us over the next 2 years. But most of that's just dead now. And then Joe Manchin, of course, isn't going to start exactly voting with the hard left because he's still afraid of his next upcoming election. Probably will lose anyway. But so most of what the Biden administration would like to do is dead on arrival. And thank goodness, but because what they had proposed in order to help people in terms of this very weak economy was only just going to make things worse.
No, right. You're entirely right there. Again, this is once again going to be a return back to the good old, what can the executive branch get away with days. And of course, the actions of the executive branch are not going to resemble the golly gosh darn blue collar America approach that Joe Biden, again, I think, and to his credit, I think competently delivered last night. We're going to have once again, the sort of people that were praising, colleagues with the weird guy in the dog fetish mask, and insulted anyone who thought that was a little odd. I mean, that's the class of people right now making the decisions for this administration. We saw. Again, there's something I don't even know if we mentioned on the site yet, but there's a massive escalation from the ATF on gun ownership by rebranding pistol grips in a way that is going to turn millions of Americans into criminals if they do not pay a new license and cost that goes along with that. Again, all this stuff not done through a legislative process at all. Again, nothing particularly new given the way that America is governed for quite some time now. But what I do think, though, that these are particularly aggressive moves outside of the norm. I mean, again, these are things that even the Obama administration did not seek to accomplish on, something as motivating for a base as the gun issue. And that's one of the things that I think, if we think about the political consequences and trying to read the trends by what DC is doing right now. Once upon a time, I think that there would have been a great concern about the blowback to overly aggressive moves, particularly on an issue like guns. I think this was always something that kind of reined in what Obama in particular did on the gun issue. And I think this speaks to the increasing polarization of American politics, where the number of, this only really matters truly within congressional districts. And as we see through a variety of self-migration, of gerrymandering, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, through the drawing of these congressional borders, there are fewer and fewer areas of the country where really bad federal policy on the right or the left, as long as it is popular with your base, really impacts political power at all. And so, that allows for, and that emboldens, I think particularly on the left, because I think you're seeing a lot of these swing districts from migration, both you see it with, this kind of the downside of people leaving parts of the Midwest or certain blue states and moving to a Florida, is that, yes, that gets you from a 2% to a 20% margin when it comes to state office, and can provide stronger political power to, again, like a DeSantis administration, doing some things that I think are really kind of exciting right now. We can talk about the Sarasota New College University coup on an episode coming up. But I think this stuff is really good as a Floridian. I'm very happy to have a very empowered, DeSantis-style Republican as the chief executive of my state. It does come at the expense of some of these swing districts, and that then, that does allow a lot more, the Democrats kind of certain policy areas that, we know there's bipartisan consensus on bad economic policy, right? Both sides are going to spin like a drunken sailor. There's going to be slight differences in what their priorities are within that. But again, some of these side issues, that's where I could see increased aggressive executive orders coming down the line. There's a secondary aspect to this too, where the one point of bipartisan consensus that I think is growing within Washington is the desire to punch at my former governor, Rick Scott. Rick Scott is someone who is very much in Mitch McConnell's doghouse or turtle house, whatever the case may be there. He is there's even rumors that a very wealthy Florida someone in the real estate industry is thinking about challenging Rick Scott, which had been completely unimaginable even just 6 months ago. And the reason why is that Scott, and again, I've got plenty of issues with Rick Scott. I mean, I'm not to raise the Rick Scott flag, but to his credit, he did take shots at Mitch McConnell. He did call out kind of the lack of any sort of real agenda, which I might, we can question the political logic of that. But Rick Scott taking on Mitch McConnell has again really put him in a sore spot within Republican circles. And he also becomes the go-to figure of Joe Biden, where they use his attempt. I mean, one of the policies that he had in sort of his sort of broad brush ideas for, reforming Washington, is, we're going to we should sunset all federal laws so that they have to be voted upon actively every 5 years. And obviously, I think within our crowd, while we would want something a lot more radical than that, I mean, this is certainly something that I don't think offends our sensibilities in terms of Washington. And we'd want to sunset them all, a lot of this stuff, or all of it entirely. But this is kind of a small, very, very modest step to something resembling. I don't want to use the word responsibility in terms of a federal setting, but a step in the right direction. And yet this is constantly kind of the go-to attack. Biden used it. He used it as kind of framing, Republicans want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And so you have this kind of constant problem that is a problem that we have ourselves, is that anything that even coming across anything that is remotely a step in the right direction of solvency or economic responsibility, fiscal conservatism. I know. I mean, even on Mises.org, you were getting hate mail for your very modest proposal of increasing the retirement age for Social Security. As soon as you venture into any of these, beholden programs, you immediately get the wrath of multiple sides coming in upon you. Another great way of the way politics works against younger age groups, the benefit of older age groups, and that again, full display last night with Rick Scott really becoming a point once again of the priority. They want to make him the kind of the face of Republican ideas, because they feel so comfortable demonizing and relatively modest proposals.
Well, what could be more democratic than forcing the legislature to vote on its existing laws every few years? What's the possible interpretation of that where that's bad, assuming you think democracy's good? And yet it's the left that constantly wants to avoid having to reaffirm support for these sorts of things. Where, hey, I thought democracy was great. Shouldn't we let the people's representatives vote on your latest schemes every few years so that they have to get approval for it from the public again? Yeah, the idea that they hate that idea and this idea of sunsetting everything just shows that, I mean, what a farce the whole idea of supporting democracy is. I mean, it's just you support it when it helps you, you hate it when it doesn't. I mean, that's all it's there for. So, yeah, I think that's a very reasonable idea. But it also actually just leads right back to your issue of executive orders. And I think that is maybe the one of the dangers you get into when you do have divided government. And so you make a good point there, right? If you can't get legislation passed through the legislature, you're just going to try and come up with more and more creative ways to govern via proclamation, via edict, via executive order. And of course, the presidency's so far down that road now where huge portions of the federal government are basically just governed by a man with a pen and a phone who puts out some big document. It used to be that everyone recognized that executive orders should only apply to the governance of federal employees, basically, and what could really kind of happen internally within the federal government. But over time, it became just a way to have federal employees write new laws, essentially, by writing new federal rules and regulations through their bureaucratic power. And so now it's a lawmaking power for everybody. And if you can't pass anything through Congress, then we'll just do that. And that's what Obama said he was going to do back when he had to deal with the Republicans in Congress. And I don't know that Obama would say that in the way that Obama did. But I think we should absolutely 100% expect him to do that. And that's a way then of catering to certain interest groups too, is like, well, thanks to those Republicans in Congress, we couldn't pass any new gun laws, but here's a bunch of new stuff I did through the ATF. And all I had to do was just sign some new paperwork, and now all those things are illegal. Thank you, my supporters. And it goes out in a fundraising letter, and mission accomplished. And now you've criminalized millions of Americans. So I think when you can't have the public debate over legislation, we should expect there to be more secret, conniving ways of changing legislation. And I think that's what the order is going to be for the next 2 years. So we better wrap up there then for this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Tho, for joining me and providing and taking a bullet by more carefully and closely watching the the State of the Union address than I was willing to do. Always appreciated. And for our listeners, thank you. We'll be back next week with another episode, and we'll see you next time.